Hey everyone, how's it going? Azren here, hope you are doing well. In this video I want to talk about music, and more specifically I want to talk about why often it can be quite challenging to understand songs in other languages. Now, as a general whole, I think there are a bunch of different reasons that apply to virtually every single language. That being said, I also think there are some reasons that are very language specific. Now, if we start with some of the general reasons, generally speaking in music, the singers are not speaking very clearly, right? Often they're mushing the words together, and often things are sung very, very quickly. And especially if you're a beginner or even an intermediate, or even like if you're like an advanced speaker, sometimes that can be really hard because the way that the words are reaching your ears are not the way that you're used to hearing them in a classroom setting, or maybe in like a regular conversation sort of setting. And so for that reason, sometimes it can be quite challenging. Also, similarly, in every language that I've come across, when you're listening to songs, one line of song does not necessarily correlate to one sentence of the song. What I mean is sometimes you might have a line which is only half of a sentence. The second half of the sentence is in the second line of the song. So unlike most reading, for example, if you're reading lyrics, for example, unlike reading most things where you have like a clear period and you could see where a sentence ends, in songs that can be harder. Additionally, if you're listening to songs, sometimes they pause at a point, right? And in normal speech, when you pause, that is the end of a sentence. But in the song, the sentence is actually meant to continue. They pause for more of a musical effect and not really for like ending a sentence per se. And that, in my perspective, really can throw people off, and it can be quite confusing. Also with music, what tends to happen is that in music they often speak quite poetically, and they often use language that you don't hear in day-to-day speech. And this is where we can start to get into some more language-specific things. I find, for example, that this will happen quite a bit in Spanish, right? In Spanish we have, for instance, this is going to be a weird example, especially for the Spanish speakers, but you have, for example, reggaeton, which is a type of Spanish music, which if you just literally read the lyrics, often they don't actually make sense. You're reading, you're like, what does that mean? Or like, it's so out there and so weirdly, I'll say poetic in quotations. It's not really poetic, but we'll call it poetic. It's so like artsy or creative, or like it makes so little sense. You're like, how can one put a sentence together in that way? And so in even reggaeton, like you see that and you're like, huh. Or love songs, that's probably a much better example of poetry. You're like listening to the song and it's so hippy-dippy and up in the clouds. You're like, what? Or rather, if you're a beginner, you're like, what? And you don't understand. Sticking on the whole Spanish, I think specifically for Spanish, you get people who, you get a lot of singers or rappers or whatever that come from different parts of the world, and because they come from different countries, they will have a very different accent or very different dialect. So for instance, often you'll hear, especially in reggaeton for example, I keep coming back to it, but in reggaeton you'll often have people from Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico, you know, often their R's turn into L's, and you might not be used to hearing that, and all of a sudden you're listening to a song and you're like, what the heck is this guy saying? Also in Spanish, like you often get people who drop the letter S. They don't pronounce the S when it is at the end of a syllable. But if you're not used to that from a class, you know, you might not understand. You're like, what? I don't get it. And so Spanish has a bunch of challenges like that. Spanish, again, sticking on Spanish, I'm not sure why a lot of Spanish is coming to mind, but sticking on Spanish for a sec too, in Spanish, it's a very vowel-heavy language. And what that means is there's lots of vowels that are often put together. And in songs, that can make it even harder to understand than maybe your average song in any other language. That all these vowels put together just sound like a bunch of mush, and you can't figure out in your brain kind of where things start and finish, and what's a word, what isn't a word, is it 2 words, is it 3 words, 4 words, how does that work? Now, another language that has some very specific things that makes it challenging would be something like Mandarin, okay? Now, and the challenge with Mandarin is actually a bit of an ironic challenge. The ironic challenge is that when you're learning to speak Mandarin, one thing that some people find quite difficult is that in Mandarin you have tones. So it's not just the sounds that are coming out of your mouth that determine like what a word is supposed to sound like versus isn't supposed to, but it's the tone and the tone of voice that comes out too. However, in songs, they actually often ignore the tones. And so you might have learned all this stuff, you've done all this time, you finally figured out, okay, here's how the tones work. You can hear them, you can say them, everything's going amazingly, and now you're hearing a song and you don't have the tones as a reference point to help you understand what's happening in the song. And you're like, that could be horse, that could be mum, what they just said, that could be, what the heck are they trying to say? And that leads to some very interesting types of challenges. I'm actually going through that right now when I'm listening to in Mandarin music sometimes. Not having the context of the tones really throws me off. So that's why I like to read the lyrics, because often I can read along and be like, oh, I get it. But when I just listen, I'm kind of like quote-unquote tone deaf, because there is no tone and I can't figure out what the word is. Switching languages here, if we go into French. Now, French is quite fascinating for me, and this might just be a personal perspective of the people I've met, the people I've come across. I'm not 100% sure on this one, but I want to throw it out there anyway, because I think it's true. I find that French over-indexes in terms of rap and hip-hop music. What I mean is, if we look at music genres in different languages, you know, obviously every single language, or many languages, have rap and hip-hop as a music genre. And yet I find that if we were to break down the percentages, like French has 50, or English has 50%, you know, top 40, 20% love songs, 10% whatever it is, right? I feel like French tends to have a slightly higher percentage of rap and hip-hop that people listen to. Maybe I'm wrong. If you feel like I'm wrong, please write in the description below, write in the comments below. But I feel like in my perspective, that's how it is. And rap, you know, what's interesting is that it's fast. It's fast, and also rap is kind of sometimes like a form of poetry, which makes it pretty tough, man. Pretty tough to fully get and fully understand what's going on. So I think rap, you know, in French, for instance, can be pretty tough per se, pretty tough. Also, going back to rap, actually, interesting point. I wasn't planning on talking about this, but let's flip back to Chinese for a sec, to Mandarin. Mandarin rap, I find, actually sometimes can be a little bit easier to understand sometimes than other songs. I feel like, maybe it's just my ears, but I feel like in Mandarin they really attack the words in a way that helps me really capture them when it's rap. But when it's sung in a very sing-songy way in like some random Chinese song or Mandarin song, it's harder to capture the words. And actually, weirdly, that leads me to another point here. This is a general thing. Often, especially if it's a very vocal, very beautiful kind of song, the intonation of the words doesn't fall on the right part of the word. Instead of saying like, you know, like, I don't know, like, for example, actually, here's a good example. There's a song by, I think, Ricky Martin in Spanish. I think it's Spanish. Yeah, of course it's Spanish. It's called Bailamos. But when he sings it, he says, bailamos. So he goes, bailamos, right? So it's O, the stress is on the O. And that happens a lot in basically every language, right? And that makes it quite tricky sometimes to figure out what the singer is trying to say. So anyway, there's a quick little 8, 9, 7, 8, 9, 10, however long that was, I guessed to me 8-minute rant, on why it's tough to understand music in different languages. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts as well. Please let me know in the comments below what you think. Yeah, if I missed anything, if you agree, disagree, I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts. So anyway, we'll chat later. Bye for now.